Good evening. Just a brief housekeeping note. I just wanted to ask everyone to turn off their cell phones if they have them. Thank you. I'm Nat Silver, guest curator of the exhibition here, Piero della Francesca in America, and I'd like to welcome you to the Frick Collection this evening. Tonight, we are delighted to be joined by Professor James R. Banker, who will deliver the second in 3 Wednesday night lectures dedicated to the celebrated Renaissance painter, Piero della Francesca. This series is made possible by the generous and continuing support of the Robert H. Smith Foundation, support for which we are profoundly grateful here at the Frick. Before we begin, I would just like to mention that tonight's event is being broadcast live on the internet. The Frick's Fora TV channel has made it possible to reach a global audience, and I extend my welcome to our online viewers. It gives me the greatest pleasure to welcome James Banker, Professor Emeritus in Italian Renaissance History at North Carolina State University. Beyond his celebrated career in teaching that spanned over 40 years, Professor Banker has served on scientific committees for several exhibitions dedicated to Piero della Francesca in Italy, held fellowships at Villa I Tatti and the American Academy in Rome, and lectured widely on early modern Italy. His contributions to the field of Renaissance studies are distinguished by a long list of publications, including the books Death in the Community, Memorialization and Confraternities in an Italian Comune in the Late Middle Ages, and The Culture of San Sepolcro during the Youth of Piero della Francesca in 2004. It was while researching his first book on confraternities in San Sepolcro that Professor Banker uncovered a wealth of documents pertaining to the lives of its 15th century citizens. This trail of clues revealed precious details about the most celebrated one of them all, Piero della Francesca. Professor Banker's discoveries in the archives of San Sepolcro and Florence are encompassing and profound. Thanks to just one of his remarkable findings made in 2001, and I emphasize from the point of view of an art historian, this was a really incredible finding, we can today reimagine the original shape of the Sant'Agostino altarpiece, 6 fragments of which are today in our exhibition at the Frick Collection. Professor Banker has transformed our understanding of Piero della Francesca's career, and we eagerly await his forthcoming monograph on the artist, which is soon to be published by Oxford University Press. Throughout the course of this project, Jim has been a guiding light, leading with his learned erudition and his infectious enthusiasm for Piero. I'm thrilled to welcome him here tonight to deliver a lecture entitled 3 Geniuses and a Franciscan Friar. Please join me in welcoming Professor James R. Banker.
Thank you, Nat. We are here tonight because of Nat Silver's inspiration to have an exhibition of the paintings of Piero della Francesca in America, here at the Frick Museum. I wish to thank him and the Frick director, Dr. Ian Wardropper, for the invitation to write an essay in the catalog of the exhibition and to be here with you tonight. I also wish to express my gratitude to the staff of the Frick for their ceaseless efforts on my behalf. Tonight, I shall mention several of Piero's paintings and give an outline of his life, but I shall concentrate more on his passion for geometry and Archimedes that supplemented and eventually surpassed his commitment to painting. I wish also to share with you how Piero became one of the preeminent geometricians of the 15th century and how his knowledge of Archimedes made its way into the mind of Leonardo. The most advanced and intriguing mathematical knowledge that we are tracing from Piero to Leonardo derives from Archimedes. Let me also note here at the beginning that much of what I shall be recounting today on Piero builds on the earlier seminal research of Marshall Clagett and the more recent research of the last decade, largely undertaken in Europe. A few introductory words on the 2 persons other than Piero and Leonardo in our discussion tonight. Archimedes died 212 BCE is generally regarded as the most important mathematician of ancient Greece and Rome, and one of the geniuses in the history of the West. He was also an inventor, being credited with the Archimedean screw, among his many other inventions. These are too numerous to mention, as are his conceptual leaps in geometry. Several of the latter will appear as we discuss Piero's contacts with the writings of Archimedes. The less well-known Luca Pacioli was born in Piero's town of Borgo San Sepolcro around 1447, a full generation after Piero. Pacioli became a Franciscan friar and taught commercial and Greek mathematics in universities and courts of Italy, eventually in Milan with Leonardo in the 1490s. Pacioli published books, real books from printing presses, on Renaissance mathematics. To understand the mathematical achievements of Piero, Luca, and Leonardo, we must note the existence of two cultures in the Renaissance. One culture was founded on knowledge of Latin and a university education. Men in this tradition, usually from noble families, sought church and government positions where they used their linguistic skills to produce Latin documents and to reproduce Latin treatises. They also tended to demean all those who worked with their hands, viewing that activity as socially denigrating and ultimately destructive of the minds of artisans. The other culture was composed of persons who were called illiterate because they could not read Latin. This group could only read and write in the vernacular and were from merchant or artisan families. An artisan worked with his hands, with which he eventually proved himself by producing a masterpiece. Painters and sculptors fell into this category of artisans, socially inferior because they worked with their hands. The bifurcation of culture underwent a fundamental change during Piero's lifetime, in part because of the creations of the artist. Many of the greatest Renaissance achievements were made by men who crossed the barriers between the two cultures. For us tonight, Piero and Leonardo. Though not educated in the university or capable of writing Latin treatises, Piero and Leonardo could read Latin and write Latin phrases, and they eventually absorbed university-based learning. Their uniting of the two cultures enabled them to make important innovations in art and thought. The division into two cultures finds its extreme expression in mathematics. In the universities, Greek mathematics and geometry made up 2 of the 7 liberal arts and was said to be the underlying basis for 2 others, music and astronomy. Geometry and optics were largely based on the writings of the Greek mathematician Euclid, who had been translated into Arabic in the early Middle Ages and from Greek to Latin in the 12th and 13th centuries in Western Europe. But mathematical instruction in the universities was largely limited to medical students who would employ it for determining the astrological bases for treatment. On the other hand, instruction in the Italian dialects, in the vernacular, in commercial mathematics flourished in the Renaissance. Just after 1200, Leonardo da Pisa, usually called Fibonacci, brought Arabic commercial mathematics and Arabic numerals to Europe and became the father of a mathematics that dealt with fractions, interest, square roots, currency exchange, and algebra, together called abaco. This practical instruction, lasting a few years for young boys, introduced them to problems that merchants of the Renaissance encountered daily. Abaco instructors produced textbooks, and this form of training was found in the large commercial centers like Florence, Venice, and Lucca, but not in Piero's Borgo and Sepolcro. And this presents us with a problem. No one knows where Piero picked up his early knowledge of mathematics. Abaco would have come easily enough to him, in part because his father, as a leather merchant and tax collector, would have had many financial account books. It is probable that Piero kept the books of his father as a youth in the 1420s. This would explain why the 16th century painter Giorgio Vasari, who wrote biographies of all the important painters and sculptors of the Renaissance, asserted that Piero concentrated on mathematics until at 15 years of age he turned to painting. On the other hand, it was undoubtedly a long process for Piero or anyone else in the 15th century to understand and to imitate the procedures of Greek geometry. Employing axioms and postulates, Greek geometricians logically deduced proofs based on proportion, similarity, and congruence. They seldom used numbers. Rather, they began and ended with verbal statements, usually about lines, planes, and angles. So words, not numbers. The geometrician Euclid flourished around 300 BCE, summarized the Greek logical deductive method in his Elements of Geometry, which served as a geometrical textbook for over 2,000 years in the West. Piero possessed his own copy of this treatise by the 1450s or 60s, and from the elements learned Greek geometry. This prepared him for Archimedes. We begin our closer analysis of Piero in the 1450s. By this time, Piero was in his 40s. He was completing a 2-decade journey through much of central Italy after having left his hometown in 1439. He painted the baptism of Christ there prior to his departure. The St. Jerome in the desert in Ancona in 1450, the St. Jerome and the donor Jacopo Anastagi, the fresco Sigismondo Malatesta before Saint Sigismundus, and a portrait of the ruler of Rimini, Sigismondo Malatesta, all three in Rimini in 1451. And for much of the 1450s, Piero painted the frescoes in the Church of San Francesco in Arezzo. Piero left Tuscany for a second sojourn in Rome, where he painted frescoes already destroyed by the 16th century in the Vatican for Pope Pius II. More importantly, while in Rome in 1458-59, he renewed his acquaintance with the papal official and architect of the urban renewal of Rome, Francesco del Borgo, whose father had married Piero's aunt, cousins once removed. We want to tarry a bit on Francesco del Borgo because he played a significant role in the life of Piero. Francesco helped facilitate a papal-led initiative to revive Greek science through translations of Greek mathematical treatises into Latin. In the 1450s, Pope Nicholas V enlarged Francesco Petrarca's earlier humanistic program that emphasized literature and history. The Pope commissioned new translations of Greek treatises, especially significant for us tonight, a translation of the works of Archimedes. We now know that this newly translated Latin version, which we shall call the Paris Manuscript, because it is today in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, was placed in the Vatican Library. It was immediately lent to members of the intellectual elite. In 1458, Francesco da Borgo removed the Archimedes translation from the Vatican Library without leaving the customary note indicating the borrower. Perhaps he chose not to sign out the manuscript because he did not intend to return it. In any event, he never did. Francesco commissioned a scribe to copy the text of Archimedes in another manuscript, which eventually was found in Urbino, and hence we shall call it the Urbino manuscript. Because he was an architect and maker of architectural plans, Francesco probably drew the 200 or so geometrical designs that illustrate the text of the Urbino manuscript. He apparently intended that he would be the owner of this manuscript because in this miniature, his name appears, probably invisible to us tonight, on the horizontal bar of the capital A. In several other miniatures, the unknown scribe or painter has depicted what appears to be the same man, in 15th century dress, studying with books and tools. The Italian historian of mathematics, Argante Ciocci, has suggested that the miniaturist has given us here the likeness of Francesco del Borgo. And one more image from that manuscript. Francesco and Piero were from Borgo San Sepolcro and were related by marriage, and both had an interest in ancient geometry, and most importantly, as we shall see in a moment, Piero came into possession of the two Archimedean manuscripts discussed above that were first in the possession of Francesco del Borgo. For these reasons, we can conclude that that Francesco shared his appreciation and his knowledge of Archimedes with Piero in Rome. Piero returned to Borgo San Sepolcro in 1459 from Rome. At this point, he entered an intense period of painting in his native town. He completed several of his most important paintings in the years 1459-62. The St. Louis of Toulouse, the St. Julian, if he had not painted it a little earlier, and he completed painting of the altarpiece for the Confraternity of Santa Maria della Misericordia. In these same years, he executed the frescoes of the Resurrection and the Madonna del Parto, as well as preparing or beginning the painting of the polyptych for the Church of Sant'Agostino, commissioned back in 1454. In the middle of the 1460s, Piero was resident in Borgo San Sepolcro and in the neighboring town of Arezzo, where he painted the Santa Maria Maddalena in the Cathedral of Arezzo and several other lost paintings in and around that city. In these years, he also completed the first of his mathematical studies, the Trattato da Abaco, or the Treatise on Abaco. I say completed because it was obviously the fruit of an extended period of study and reflection. Piero informs us early in the work that someone who had great authority and who could not be denied asked him to write a textbook on Abaco. The first portion of the book is what traditionally had been presented in textbooks, going back 2.5 centuries: fractions, roots, squares, algebra, and the rule of three. Piero apparently thought that boys preparing to be merchants needed a great deal of instruction in the rule of three, as he gave many examples. The rule of three is a basic calculation which we would set up as A is to B as C is to D. Piero discusses it in verbal phrases, writing, quote, the rule of three says one should multiply the thing one wants to know by what is dissimilar to it, and one divides the result by the remaining thing. And the number that comes from this is of the nature of that which is dissimilar to the first term, and the divisor is always similar to the thing which one wants to know about. For example, 7 lengths of cloth are worth 9 lira. What will 5 lengths be worth? Do it like this, he says. Multiply the quantity you want to know by that quantity which 7 lengths of cloth are worth. That is 9 lira. 5 times 9 makes 45, divide by 7, and what comes out, the answer, is 6 lira and a remainder of 3/7, unquote. I go into some detail on the rule of three in part because Piero did so, but also because it is illustrative of a quality of Piero's mind. The rule of three is basically solving a problem by proportion. Proportion is at the center of all the activities of Piero, here in mathematics, but also in geometry, in the organization of pictorial space, and especially in perspective. Proportion is the underlying principle. The second and more important part of the treatise on Abaco is Piero's discussion of geometry, which had been a minor part of earlier textbooks and then only for practical problems like measuring distances. Piero elevated the Abaco discourse by shifting almost exclusively to theoretical problems. He discusses the polygons of plane geometry, concentrating on solving problems of the relationship of angles to sides and areas. He was especially interested in the regular bodies, sometimes called regular solids, and irregular bodies. I shall delay our discussion of these more important propositions until we examine Piero's second and later mathematical treatise. In his treatise on Abaco, he already demonstrates a working knowledge of Greek geometrical methodology and of Euclid's elements. Piero was encouraged by the Greek to contemplate the importance of proportion. It is a central idea of Euclid as well. Piero mentions Archimedes and says he has taken material from him, but it is clear that he is citing the Greek concepts through one or more medieval commentator. Given my earlier discussion of Piero's interaction with Francesco da Borgo and the latter's interest in Archimedes, one might expect that Piero would have celebrated Archimedes in his Tractato, but he does not. Piero's relationship at this point to Archimedes is complicated. He does not cite him directly. He does not cite the text of Archimedes. This is strange, unless we take the most likely explanation that in Tuscany in the 1460s, he had as yet no copy of Archimedes in hand. Just after having completed his treatise on Abaco in the mid-60s, Piero painted 3 masterpieces in the late 1460s. The large and beautiful Sant'Antonio altarpiece in Perugia. The flagellation, probably realized in Urbino, the Sant'Agostino altarpiece. For this photomontage of Sant'Agostino, I thank Elena Squillattani and Giacomo Guazzini, young Italian scholars, who present their findings in the exhibition catalog. In the 1460s, Piero was at the height of his powers and realized his most Piero-esque paintings. That is, monumental figures placed into a fully realized perspectival space. He positioned sculpted human beings in an imagined but real historical world. In this period, Piero also began to accumulate materials for his second book, his Prospectiva Pengendi, or On Perspective in Painting, which I believe was being completed in the mid-1470s. We shall not comment on this highly original work here, except to note that he does not mention Archimedes at all in the treatise. In the period of the 1470s, Piero divided his time between Borgo San Sepolcro and the Marche town of Urbino. In the former, San Sepolcro, he painted his only large classical figure, the Hercules, for his family home. In Urbino, he received 3 commissions from the ruler of the town, Federico da Montefeltro. The so-called Uffizi diptych with portraits of Federico and his wife Battista Sforza, the Brera altarpiece of a Madonna and Child with saints and angels, and the Senegalia Madonna and Child with angels. Late in the 1470s, Piero made a radical change in his activities, almost abandoning painting. He executed only 2 extant paintings thereafter. Instead, he finished On Perspective in Painting in the vernacular specific to Borgo San Sepolcro, and then set up a scriptorium with all the equipment and assistants, scribes and at least 1 translator, necessary to produce at least 8 manuscripts, most notably 5 copies of his On Perspective. This constituted a substantial enterprise that would have consumed a great deal of his time and energy. His participation in the making of the manuscripts differs from one to the other. In this manuscript, in Parma, he wrote the Italian text completely in his hand, as well as drawing all the diagrams, over 100. These he has created to instruct an apprentice on how to draw paintings in perspective. In the Reggio Emilia example, he copied 2 pages of the text in Italian, and again, drew all the diagrams. And in the manuscript, in the Ambrosiano Library in Milan, Piero has added corrections in Latin to the Latin texts, as well as, again, drawing all the instructional diagrams. Finally, in a Latin version of the On Perspective, today in Bordeaux, Piero made Latin corrections in the margins of the Latin text. Why he decided to supervise and intervene in the production of all these copies of his book On Perspective is one of the many mysteries that perplex observers of Piero's life. One of the more important discoveries of the last decade concerning Piero is that his fascination with Archimedes went far beyond reading about him in the comments of others. Piero in the late 1470s gained access to the 2 manuscripts of the work of Archimedes, the Paris and Urbino manuscripts, that Francesco de Borgo had possessed in the 1450s. Borrowing portions of both of these manuscripts, Piero sat down and copied in his own hand all the treatises of Archimedes and drew approximately 225 geometrical diagrams, all extant today in a manuscript in the Ricardiano Library in Florence. Again, this copying of the manuscript was a time and energy-consuming project, in part because of the need of first gaining the intellectual expertise necessary to understand the Latin text, and then to link the Latin phrases with the geometrical images. I shall raise here the question of whether Piero thought in Latin or in Italian while dealing with the geometry of Archimedes. Here we have no proof, but because Piero never wrote a sequence of Latin sentences or a succession of Latin paragraphs, I am inclined to hypothesize that he reconceptualized Latin in his native Italian. If so, he would have had, in many cases, to invent Italian words for the difficult Latin geometrical terms, and to rethink the procedures of Archimedes in Italian. It is clear that he understood the diagrams in the two manuscripts. In certain instances, Piero discovered that the diagrams in the two manuscripts did not follow the logic of the text, and he had to correct the errors he found in the geometry of the diagrams. This demonstrates that Piero was not simply a scribe copying the words in diagrams, but a geometrician thinking through the implications of the Latin text. Note that the first page of the manuscript, has no title or author or the scribe or the name of the scribe who wrote the manuscript. How do we know that it is Piero's? In notes to his last will and testament, we see the G. I hope we can all see it here. The A. And let's see if we can find, it's a little hard from this angle. And let's see if we can find an E, which is difficult from my angle, I'm sorry, which is written like a Z. So the E is like a Z. Now we move back to the Archimedes manuscript, and we see in this blow-up of the first lines the same letters, the G, the A, and especially the E as a Z. And I trust we can locate those. The fact that the hand in the testamentary notes and in the manuscript is the same, and the fact that there's such a beauty in the diagrams that Piero drew at least convinces me that we have here a complete manuscript of Archimedes written by Piero. And I especially note the spirals at the bottom of the page. Access to and possession of manuscripts of Archimedes was limited in the Renaissance. Only a few enjoyed that privilege, and they were in the Latin university elite or humanists with a university education. We should note that there are only 5 or 6 extant Latin manuscripts of Archimedes in the 15th century, or from the 15th century. Piero was probably the only person in the 15th century to hold in his hands 3 of these manuscripts of Archimedes. That Piero was one of the most important geometricians of the 15th century is even more clear when we examine his third book, the Libellus de Quinque Corporibus Regularibus, or the little book on the 5 regular bodies. Piero tells us that he wrote this book late in life, thus in the 1480s, and in part to keep the torpor at bay when it invaded his aged mind. He also tells us at the beginning of the book, and one of the few passages where he says anything personal, that he wished to obtain the fame similar to that of the ancient painters and sculptors. In writing the Libellus, Piero began a whole new genre of mathematical literature. No one previously had isolated the subject of the 5 regular bodies in a book. Not that the regular bodies had been neglected. They were discussed from Plato and Euclid to medieval writers. First, some definitions. A regular polygon has equal sides and equal angles. Thus, one of the chief subjects of plane geometry. A regular body is a solid geometrical shape, a polyhedron, made of a specific type of irregular polygon, a cube, for example. In each regular body, all sides and angles are the same and have identical faces. When combined to create a solid, the polygons of the regular body form themselves identically at their vertices. The simplest regular body is a tetrahedron, a solid form with 4 equilateral triangles. Another simple regular body is the cube. We have here 6 squares. All line segments are equal, the faces are the same, all the angles are 90 degrees, and are arranged around their vertices in the same manner. The other 3 regular bodies are more complex. The octahedron has 8 equilateral triangles. The dodecahedron has 12 faces of regular pentagons. And the last is the icosahedron, composed of 20 equilateral triangles. Several Greek writers were intrigued with these 5 regular bodies, as was Piero. Plato, in his late work, the Timaeus, viewed the 5 regular bodies as the building blocks of the universe, with 4 of the bodies equated with the earth, water, air, fire, and the 5th, the most complex icosahedron, with the ether of the heavens. But Piero would have none of this. He was interested in the regular bodies as theoretical geometrical constructions, which could be used to understand other elements of geometry, areas, measurement of sides, and especially the relationship of the regular bodies to the spheres that would be placed inside or around the regular bodies. Here, Piero used the formula of Archimedes of 3 1/7 for the relationship of the diameter to the circumference and the circle's area, along with many other borrowings. In the Libellus, Piero cited Archimedes with such accuracy that he must have had his copy of the works of the Greek geometrician in hand, which he would consult to cite specific propositions by title and number. Despite the title of the little book on the 5 regular bodies, the most sophisticated geometry is in the last section, where Piero discusses the 13 Archimedean or irregular bodies. A solid or polyhedron was irregular when it was composed of either 2 or 3 regular polygons, or stated differently, each was composed of 2 or 3 types of equilateral and equal angular polygons. The fact that each of the 13 had more than one regular polygon made each irregular. Archimedes is credited with first identifying these forms. Until the modern world, knowledge of how to construct several of these solids was unknown. Already in his earlier treatise on abaco, Piero had discussed 2 of the 13 regular bodies. In one of these discussions, he took a regular tetrahedron and cut off the vertices in the middle of the sides, and then connected the 2 vertices with lines. He had constructed an irregular body called a truncated tetrahedron with 4 equilateral triangles and 4 equilateral hexagons. In the second, he constructed a truncated cube by cutting the vertices of, or cutting the sides of the cube 1/3 down the sides and connecting the 2 points, thereby producing an irregular body of 6 pentagons and 8 equilateral triangles. In the Libellus, he discussed how to construct 3 others. In the 15th century, Piero was one of the few who wrote on these irregular solids. The truncated tetrahedron and truncated cube were relatively easy to make, but the construction of other more difficult irregular bodies required the use of the golden mean, and thus not a whole number. For two irregular bodies, he was the only person in the 15th century who knew how to make them. Where he learned how to construct the two is unknown. The one ancient Greek source on this was not available to him in the 15th century. I would suggest that Piero was able to construct these irregular bodies because of his distinctive visual acuity. He brought his graphic skills from his preparatory drawings for paintings to his study of geometry. This enabled him to see and construct solutions rather than to read them from an ancient text. In one final example of his geometrical sophistication, Piero imagined and solved a famous problem in the history of mathematics, which originated with Archimedes in his treatise on method that was only recovered in the 20th century. Hence, Piero could not have known of the problem from Archimedes. And in fact, there's no surviving explanation from Archimedes himself on how to solve the problem. In a simplified form, Archimedes challenged a fellow geometrician to determine the common value of two crossing cylinders. This problem led Piero into a long discussion of measuring cones, cylinders, and ellipses. Because he had no available ancient or contemporary source that raised or solved this problem, in all likelihood, Piero undertook to imagine and to solve the problem from his knowledge of the architecture of crossing vaults, which were very common in the 15th century. They were seen in buildings, drawings, and paintings. In fact, in his On Perspective in Painting, Piero drew such a vault. This Archimedean problem, in its use of a drawing from Piero's treatise, and his graphic skills for painting, are an excellent example of the way Piero combined Latin verbal culture of the university with the vernacular visual culture of the workshop. The emphasis on geometry in writing by Piero is the other side of the reality that Piero had largely abandoned painting in his later years. It may have been that he received no commission that interested him or challenged him. The one painting he surely executed in the 1480s, the Nativity, never left his home until the 19th century and was probably intended for his home. The other possible painting from this period, around 1480, is in the nearby Oval Room. The Williamstown Madonna and Child with Angels from around 1480 was also probably intended for a home. In the last 15 years of his life, Piero concentrated his attention on his hometown and family, and apparently did not receive or accept in that period a commission for a publicly displayed painting. This turn inward to Borgo San Sepolcro and his family tracked an emphasis for home settings, or at least non-public settings, in his late paintings. The Book of the Dead of Borgo San Sepolcro record the death of their famous citizen, Piero, on October 12, 1492. In this Book of the Dead, we can barely read the words in the middle, below the Italian word for October, Piero di Benedetto Franceschi. And here they say that he was the famous painter. Giorgio Vasari, a half-century later, opened his biography of Piero by noting that his mathematical accomplishments went unnoticed because they were, quote, they were falsely claimed by the presumption of one who sought to conceal his ass's skin under the honorable spoils of the lion. Hence, the true craftsman is robbed of the honor that is due to his labors, as it happened to Piero della Francesca of Borgo San Sepolcro. He, having been held a rare master of the difficulties of drawing regular bodies, as well as of arithmetic and geometry, was yet not able to bring to light his noble labors in the many books written by him, which are still preserved in the Borgo, his native place. The very man who should have striven with all his might to increase the glory and fame of Piero, from whom he had learnt all that he knew, was impious and malignant enough to seek to blot out the name of his teacher, and to usurp for himself the honor that was due to the other, publishing under his own name, Fra Luca Pacioli del Borgo, all the labors of that good man, Piero, unquote. There has been a scholarly debate on Luca Pacioli's culpability. But on Luca Pacioli's theft of Piero's intellectual property, I tend to agree with Vasari that the ass stole the lion's spoils. But we shall forego a discussion of this debate. But I do want to note very quickly some items in this image. First, on the bottom right, note the book, the closed book, which, while we can't see it, does have abbreviations indicating the book is by Luca Pacioli. Also, take a look at the open book that Pacioli is pointing to. An historian of mathematics has figured out that this is actually the elements of Euclid, and he's able to identify the precise proposition. Lastly, let us notice on the left the irregular body. It's transparent, and if we could see clearly enough, we could see that it reflects the two personages in the painting. This is an irregular body of 8 regular triangles and 18 squares. I have no interest tonight in indicting for plagiarism Pacioli, but I wish to describe what he took from Piero, especially the painter's insights from Archimedes. As I initially indicated, Pacioli became a Franciscan friar and a university professor in mathematics. Already in 1478, he was a lecturer in Perugia on commercial mathematics, and eventually he taught mathematics in the courts or universities in Rome, Naples, Florence, Milan, Bologna, and elsewhere. In 1494, Pacioli published in Venice a book entitled The Summa of Arithmetic, Geometry, Proportions, and Proportionality. In this work, Piero disseminated a broad swath of medieval and Renaissance mathematics, which became the textbook of mathematics for 16th century Europe. In the section entitled Particularis Tractatus in the Summa, Pacioli borrowed directly from the geometrical portions of Piero's treatise on Abaco. Pacioli laid out 56 exercises on regular and irregular bodies borrowed from Piero's treatise. About 50% of them are taken nearly word for word from Piero. Pacioli continued to lecture at various universities and courts until his death in 1517. In 1498 and 1512, he published his Divine Proportion. Here he finds mystical signs in this divine proportion, which is the same as the golden section. In this book, Pacioli has taken Piero's Latin Libellus, his little book on the 5 regular bodies, and translated the whole book into Italian and published it as his own without even hinting Piero was the author. He also has another section on the regular and irregular bodies in the book where he repeats much of this same material, this time taken from Piero's earlier treatise on Abaco. Pacioli does praise Piero as, quote, the monarch of painting, unquote, and seems proud to claim him as a co-citizen of Borgo San Sepolcro. but Pacioli carefully avoids even suggesting that Piero had any mathematical interest. He does note that in Piero's book on painting, that 9 out of 10 books are devoted to proportion. But he does not acknowledge that his own interest in proportion and geometry has any relationship to Piero's concentration on proportion in either painting or geometry. Pacioli had another important role to play in the dissemination of the knowledge and teachings of Archimedes. Pacioli, like Piero, was fascinated with irregular and irregular bodies. In the late 1480s, Pacioli made or supervised the construction of models of the regular bodies, which he presented to the son of Federico da Montefeltro and ruler of Urbino, Guidobaldo. In the years 1496 to 1499, Luca Pacioli and Leonardo da Vinci were brought into the circle of scholars and artists recruited by Ludovico Sforza, ruler of Milan. There, the artists and the mathematician became friends and collaborators. Leonardo, at that point, was already established as an important painter in Florence and made claims to Sforza of his abilities in military engineering. At the time of his entrance into the court in Milan, an examination of Leonardo's early notebooks shows that he was a poor mathematician. But with the aid of Pacioli, he became an expert geometrician and a great admirer of Euclid and Archimedes. Even before their convergence in Milan in 1496, Leonardo had purchased Pacioli's Summa on mathematics. Leonardo says at one point in his journals, "I learned multiplication of the roots from Master Luca." We do not have time to discuss Leonardo's astute borrowings from Archimedes. It is clear, though, that he possessed one of the manuscripts of Archimedes in the family of manuscripts discussed above, either the Paris, Urbino, or Piero's manuscript. During the 3 years in Milan, Leonardo borrowed ideas on proportion directly from Pacioli. They both elevate the importance of proportion. For example, in 1497, Leonardo says, quote, "Proportion is not only found in numbers and in measurements, but truly also in sounds, weights, and clocks." This is taken nearly word for word from Pacioli's Summa. There are many more borrowings that show that Leonardo depended on Pacioli for his schooling in mathematics. Pacioli published 59 drawings of the regular and irregular bodies in the divine proportion. And in the early 1500s, he presented wooden models of these bodies to the government of Florence. Pacioli also included the 59 designs in his divine proportion. In that book, he stated that his close relationship to Leonardo led the painter to assist him by drawing the regular and irregular bodies. And we see several here drawn by Leonardo. By the early 1500s, Leonardo began to show his own interest in Archimedes. For one, among many reasons for his interest, is that Leonardo became interested in the problem of squaring the circle. He was also searching for a copy of the works of Archimedes and made mental notes to himself on where his manuscripts were located. On one occasion, he said that the brother of a cleric had a copy of a complete Archimedes in Rome, and that it had been stolen in 1502 from the Urbino library by Cesare Borgia, the warrior son of Pope Alexander VI. This manuscript was likely the one that Francesco da Borgo commissioned in 1457-58 that we named the Urbino manuscript. On another occasion, Leonardo notes that one could retrieve a manuscript of Archimedes from the Bishop of Padua, we'll ignore this, and, more importantly, quote, from Vitellozzo, the one from Borgo San Sepolcro. Now, which manuscript is Leonardo speaking of as being in Borgo San Sepolcro? It is probably not the one from Urbino, the one stolen by Cesare Borgia. That was in Rome. The Vitellozzo that Leonardo mentions was the ruler of Città di Castello, 10 miles south of Borgo San Sepolcro. Vitellozzo Vitelli was also a captain in Cesare Borgia's mercenary army. He was made famous by Machiavelli, who recounted in The Prince that in 1502, Vitellozzo was treacherously murdered by Borgia. Earlier in that year, Leonardo, as cartographer for Borgia, had accompanied Borgia and Vitellozzo as they passed through the area around Borgo San Sepolcro and Città di Castello. Hence, Leonardo probably gained his knowledge of the Archimedes manuscript through Vitellozzo, or while in the region of the Upper Tiber around Borgo San Sepolcro. It is possible that the manuscript that Leonardo was referring to was the Paris one that Francesco de Borgo had taken from the Vatican Library and never returned. It might have been sent to Borgo San Sepolcro after Francesco's death as part of his patrimony. We know that Piero at one point had access to it. It is also possible that Leonardo knew from Vitellozzo of the manuscript of Archimedes that Piero had copied in his own hand, and that remained in the hands of the painter's nephews. Vitellozzo and Piero are documented as having at least a passing familiarity. Late in life, Piero served as a witness for Vitellozzo in a notarial document. One hopes the mystery of how Leonardo knew of the Borgo San Sepolcro manuscript of Archimedes is on its way of being solved. Piero was one of the first in modern Europe to possess an intense interest in Archimedes. By citing the Greek geometrician in his 2 mathematical treatises, and eventually in copying approximately the Greeks' 150 pages and over 200 geometrical designs in his own hands. Piero took 5 important ideas from his much revered books of Euclid and Archimedes: the methods of proof, the 5 regular bodies, the golden section, and the Archimedean or irregular bodies, especially going beyond all his contemporaries in his ability to discuss and draw the regular bodies. Lastly, Piero took from Euclid and Archimedes the importance of proportion in geometry and applied it to his painting, especially in emphasizing the essential importance of perspective in painting. Piero also began a way of thinking in geometry that broke with Greek precedents. His practices laid the basis for an element of modern science. The Greeks wrote their geometrical treatises in grammatical phrases and made their proofs arguing from assumed axioms and postulates. These proofs were not established with numbers, but through similarity and congruence. Nurtured initially in commercial mathematics in Abaco, Piero was accustomed to constructing problems through numbers. He added, he subtracted, he divided, and so on, in Arabic numbers. When Piero came to write on geometry, he combined the two mathematics, which I shall remind you derive from 2 cultural traditions. By placing the numbers and procedures of Abaco within the form of argumentation of the Greeks, Piero succeeded in numerizing geometry. It was just another step to say that this numerical geometry expressed the underlying structure of nature. Certainly, Luca Pacioli believed and wrote this, but whether Piero did as well is an open problem that researchers will want to address in the future. Thank you.